Hello, I'm Doug Montgomery, and I would like to welcome you back to our monthly experimental design fireside chat. I run this fireside chat every month as part of our design of experiments course on Coursera. I always have a guest speaker, and we explore topics and applications of experimental design. We always have some time for Q&A. It's a great time to ask questions, whether it's either about anything in the Coursera course or anything specific situation that you're dealing with, or anything about the topic that our guests explore. We record all of these, and if you're on Coursera, you will find these posted in the fireside chat recordings to your course. They're in the resources tab of your course. A little bit about how we'd like to run this. Please keep your microphones muted and your cameras off during the session, because that will help us avoid any background noise that might disturb things. If you want to submit a question to either me or to the guests, please use the chat function on the Zoom menu bar to do that. And you don't have to wait until the Q&A begins. You can put that question in anytime you would like. We also get some questions usually ahead of time, and we're going to try to get to all of these during the fireside chat. But if we can't, we'll get them answered. We'll respond to those in Coursera for those people that are involved. I'm so lucky we have two guests today. And they're going to do a tag team presentation. Christine M. Anderson Cook is a statistician. She's a retired guest scientist in the Statistical Sciences Group at Los Alamos National Lab. She has a broad range of research interests: statistical engineering, experimental design, reliability, multiple criteria optimization, response surface methods. She's a fellow of the ASA, a fellow of the ASQ. I am fortunate to have worked with her on a number of research projects and written some papers together with her. We're really fortunate to have her with us. And our other guest is Lulu, who is an associate professor of statistics in the Department of Math and Stat at the University of South Florida in Tampa. She was a postdoctoral research associate at Los Alamos in the Statistical Sciences Group, and that's where I think you first hooked up with Christine. She also has a broad range of research areas: statistical engineering, design of experiments, reliability, response surface methods, survey sampling, multiple objective optimization. These are two really talented and experienced people, and we're really lucky to have them with us today for our fireside chat. They've got a really interesting topic that they're going to be talking about. It has to do with space filling designs, and I'm going to at this point turn things over to Christine and Lou and let them run with the program.
Thanks, Doug. Can everyone see that? Does that look good to you, Doug?
I've got it.
All right. So Lou and I are delighted to be here today, and we're going to talk a little bit about space filling designs and some of the new innovations that we've come up with to sort of make them a more flexible tool for people to use. So I think probably in the course that you've been taking with Doug, you've been focused primarily on model-based designs. And so what we mean by that is fitting the responses that we get with a low-order polynomial. And so that works very well. Here's an example where we have just a single input, x1, and sometimes a straight line works pretty well. Or if we have just some simple curvature, then those model-based designs, so think screening designs, response surface designs, things that you've talked about, factorials, things like that, that's a really good choice for an awful lot of physical experiments. Or if we're just looking at a local region. In local regions, a lot of things are well behaved. And so these model-based designs work really nicely. But that doesn't cover all of the possibilities. Space filling designs work well when we just don't have a clue what to expect, or if we anticipate discontinuities, or if there's rapid changes in the functions. So a lot of computer experiments, or if we're looking at a very big region, then it can be very helpful to have space filling designs as one of the tools in our repertoire. So on the right-hand side, you can see a wiggly curve there in blue, and then a red curve or a red line, set of lines where there's a discontinuity somewhere in that region. So that's when we might think about using a space filling design. And because they have very different objectives, you might expect that the designs that they produce look quite different. So model-based designs, there's an underlying assumed model that we're working with. And so we generally focus on good estimation of the parameters for that model. So think D optimality, A optimality. Those are ones that focus on good estimation of the parameters of the assumed model. We also often want good prediction of the responses, so G or I optimality. But again, there's this underlying model that we assume is sensible for the relationship between the inputs and the responses. So I've shown an example here, our old friend, the central composite design for two factors, X1 and X2, in a rectangular region. And this does really well for estimation of the model parameters for that second order model. So we want simple curvature, or for prediction when that second order model is correct. So a space filling design focuses on different things. So it focuses on the spread of points throughout the region. So a maxi-min design maximizes the minimum distance between design points. So it's trying to push those design points far apart from each other. And a mini-max design tries to make the distance between anywhere in the region and the closest design point as close as possible. So the example here, you'll see the geometry of it looks very different than the central composite design. This is a Latin hypercube design. And if you scan from left to right for X1 or top to bottom for X2, you can see that we actually have 10 different levels of each of the X's, and they're spread throughout the region. So sometimes we just want to get lots of levels of each of the factors to make sure that we don't miss a feature if we're not sure what to expect. And so we're going to talk about space filling designs for the rest of our time and just show you some of the possibilities.
Christine,
So,
can I
yes,
interrupt for a moment? Because
certainly.
we do talk about some of the basics of this in the course, but really in the context of deterministic computer experiments. So,
Okay.
so people that are taking the course, if they've taken course 3 within the course, they will definitely have had some prior exposure to this. And I've focused mainly on like Latin hypercube type designs because they seem to be really popular. And so and a little bit on the new fast flexible filling designs that are in JUMP. So that's what if people are that far along in the course, they will have seen that.
Okay, that nice to have an anchor of where this connects. So thanks. And so the goal of all of those space filling designs to this point has been uniformity. So spread the points evenly throughout the design space. And Lou and I think that applies to a lot of situations, but there are situations where we know more. So we have some available information, and we'll demonstrate that shortly. And so we want to match what we know with what the objectives are of the experiment. So whenever you start collecting data, you want to know why you're collecting it. And so the objective of the experiment should really help guide what you're trying to accomplish. And so we'll talk a little bit about non-uniform space filling design. So emphasizing one region that's probably more interesting to us for a particular objective than others. And so de-emphasizing the less interesting bits. And then input response space filling designs, connecting to Doug's example of a computer experiment. Sometimes those responses get used as inputs for a later stage of modeling. And so it's really nice not just to have good properties in the input space, but also cover the whole range of possible values for the responses. And then I'll talk a little bit about sequential design of experiments, a very underutilized technique, I think, for many people. And that's where you collect a little bit of data, figure out what happened, and then make choices for the later data that you collect based on what you've learned in that first exploration. So learn as you go, avoid wasting resources, and sort of adapt your strategy as you understand things. All right, so space filling designs are very popular in a lot of different contexts, but they focus on this sort of flexibility that comes with not really knowing what to expect and being adaptable. So it's going to perform well for lots of models, as opposed to model-based designs, which tend to focus on a single model and do really well for that. The current practice focuses on achieving this uniformity of spread. And so we'll demonstrate how that may not always be the most sensible strategy. And we'll have this running example from a computer experiment where the surface looks like this. So we've got a deep valley and then a high peak, and things are happening fairly quickly in this two-dimensional space. So what can we do if we have some information, and we'll vary what we know through our examples, but what can we do to take advantage of that to adapt to this situation? So there's a contour plot of the same example, and you can see the deep valley on the left side and then the peak on the right side. And we've got a range of values from about -0.4 to +0.4. So what might we be trying to accomplish with the experiment? Well, exploration is certainly a common goal, just understanding what's going on in this space. We want to predict the response values well throughout the design space, and so have good precision wherever we want to sample or get a new observation in the future. We want to know what to expect. We often want to optimize the response. So here we might want to minimize the function, find the smallest value, or find the biggest value. And so we might want to optimize. And then we want to have this good coverage of the response values. This connects to the idea that how we use the responses might involve some next stage of modeling or experimentation. So we want good coverage of those ranges. And then sometimes we want to do this sequential learning, which I think is a strategy we should always think about. Can we break our experiment into smaller pieces and make sure we don't waste resources by sort of taking in what we've learned so far? So here is a 20-run uniform space filling design. And so all our examples will involve having a budget of 20 runs. And so this, as you can see, fills the space very nicely. But if this is actually what our underlying function is, we probably haven't done that well. So a full 60% of the resources, so 12 of the 20 runs, end up in sort of the boring parts of the function, right? They're all around the edges where it's flat and uninteresting. And so that may not be very satisfying in terms of using those experimental resources. So depending on the goal of the experiment, we may want to vary the density of those responses and emphasize some regions where the interesting bits are, and then de-emphasize some of the less interesting bits. And so we'll sort of walk through some scenarios of what we know and how we can connect that to a good design with some of these new tools that we've developed. So I'll pass it over to Lou, and she'll talk about some of the specifics for us.
Thanks, Christine. So next, I'm going to talk about some alternative design choices to the uniform space filling design. The first kind is the non-uniform space filling, or NUSF design. So different from the traditional uniform space filling design, which often aim for an even spread of design points, the NUSF design allows varied density of design points throughout the input space. And this is achieved by allowing the users to choose customized weights for a candidate set of points that span the design space. Generally, larger weights will corresponding to higher desired density of points. And then we can use a weight-adjusted distance to measure the spread of the design points. And we aim to maximize the minimum pairwise weighted distance to create the NUSF design. So the main idea is that larger weights will allow the design points to be physically closer together, and therefore will put more design points in the region. Next, please. So here is an example where we want to generate a 30-run NUSF design over a two-dimensional input space. So our goal here is to maximize the response value. And then the contour plot here reflect our prior knowledge about the anticipated response surface. So we expect to have larger response values near the top right corner, and we want to put more design points in that region. There's a tuning parameter that we use in the design selection process, which is this maximum weight ratio. So this quantity determines the degree of variation between the maximum and minimum density of design points throughout the input space. So it's a dial that we use to tune the degree of non-uniformity of the generated design. And you can see for our example here, as we increase the maximum weight ratio from left to right, we're actually increasing the degree of non-uniformity of the generated design, and we're putting more design points in the desired optimal region. Next slide, please. So now we're gonna look at a few more examples here where the NUSF design could be a natural choice to help better serve the experimental goals. And we're gonna still focus on our main example here, where the top right shows the anticipated response surface based on our prior knowledge. So suppose our primary goal here is try to optimize the response value. And given our interest in both the maximum and minimum locations, so we use the absolute value of the anticipated response as our preliminary weights to generate the NUSF design. So the plots on this slide here shows two NUSF designs that we generated with different choice of the maximum weight ratios. And we can see both designs put more points in the inner design region, especially around the maximum and minimum locations. And also, as we increase the maximum weight ratio, we can see we can emphasize the interested design region more, and we have higher density of the design points in the optimal region. So our general recommendation is to look at different choices of the maximum weight ratio and compare the generated designs to choose the best match with our desired density. Next slide, please. Oops. I think it should be the slide before this one.
Sorry.
Yes, yeah, that's okay. Yeah, so the previous case was focusing on optimization, but what if our primary interest is to obtain a precise estimate of the response throughout the input space? So the plot on the left-hand side shows the anticipated standard deviation of the response surface. So the experts think, in our case, there's a rapid change of the response values between the maximum and minimum location. So they expect the middle of the design region have higher density. And then around the corners and edges, the surface is expected to be more flat, so there's smaller variance associated with that region. The plot on the right-hand side shows if we have chosen the uniform space filling design, and then 13 out of the 20 runs, which is more than 60% of the design resource, will be put in the small variance region. So in this case, we want to emphasize the middle region more to obtain better estimate of response. Next slide, please. So you can see here, we use the anticipated standard deviation of the response as the preliminary ways to generate the NUSF designs. By using the different maximum ratio, we can adjust the density of the design points in the more interesting region, which is the region has the larger variation. Next slide, please. So now, what if we care about both precise estimation and optimization? And our method can actually adapt for this case to combine the two objectives when we're creating the weights for design construction. So for example, we can start with two sets of separate preliminary weights based on the anticipated response values and the uncertainty. And then we can scale the weights based on the selected maximum weight ratio for each objective. And then we can multiply the scaled weights to obtain the combined weights for design construction. So the plot here shows two NUSF designs that were generated with different combinations of the maximum weight ratio for the two objectives. And you can see here the contour plot shows the distribution of the combined weights. And as we're increasing the maximum weight ratio, we're actually increasing the density of the design points in the more interesting region with more interested response values and also more variation for the anticipated response. Next slide, please. So the previous examples all focus on the input values. But next, I'm going to talk about a different kind of design that considers not only the input value, but also the response values. Traditional space filling design all focus exclusively on either good spread or good coverage throughout the input space. And that could result in less desirable distribution of the response values. For example, many design points could have similar response values, or there might be undesired large gaps in the response value. For our running example here, the plot on the left-hand side shows the uniform space filling design over the input space. And from now on, we're going to call it input space filling or ISF design. And you can see it offers very nice spread over the input space. But if you look at the response value on the right-hand side, which is shown by the green vertical lines, and the histogram shows the distribution of the response over the input space for those candidate points. And you can see majority of the design points has the response value that's located between negative 0.05 and 0.05. So it's a very narrow range compared to the entire range of the response value between negative 0.4 and 0.4. So we have more than 60% of the runs covering only 10% of the response values. And then outside that middle region, you can see large gaps of the response values. Next, please. So this can cause problems if good spread and coverage of the response values are desirable. For example, in some applications, a process could have multiple stages, and then the response from an earlier stage could be used as inputs for a model at a later stage. So having good coverage of the response value from an earlier design could mean a good coverage of the input value for a later design. Another application is the inverse problems, where we're interested in predicting the unknown inputs from the observed response. So in some analysis of the inverse problem, the role of the input and response variable can actually switch. So in this case, good coverage of the response values could mean good coverage in the input value for the inverse prediction. So given all this desire of having good coverage in the response values, for some applications, so we developed this input response space filling or IRSF design. Next, please. So the main idea is like this. If we focus only on the input space, and then we could end up with poor coverage in the response values as shown in the ISF design in the top plots. And if we focus on the response values, we can generate the response space filling or RSF design, which is shown in the bottom plots. And you can see the RSF design, which is shown in the purple color here. It achieves perfect space filling for the response value, but it misses large region of the input space, and particularly around the corners and the edges of the input space. So it's not surprising that focusing on a single dimension could usually lead to suboptimal performance on the other dimension. Next slide, please. So in order to balance the performance in both the input and response values, we recommend looking for designs that's on the Pareto front, based on simultaneously optimizing the maximum distance in both the input and response spaces. So the Pareto front is formed by the set of non-dominated solutions, which are not outperformed by any other solution based on all the criteria under consideration. So if we look at our problem, the plot on the right-hand side, we're trying to maximize the minimum pairwise distance in both the input and response spaces. And you can see the big red star in the top right corner of that plot represents the utopia point, which gives the best performance based on the both criteria. Unfortunately, this usually cannot be achieved by a real solution. So the Pareto front contains all the attainable solutions that's located in the outer edge of the criterion space that's closest to the utopia point. So for any design that's on the Pareto front, we cannot find another design that performs strictly better based on both criteria. But for the designs that are not on the Pareto front, we can always find a design from the Pareto front that performs better. So the Pareto front offers a objective set of good solutions to be considered for further design selection. The plot on the right-hand side shows the Pareto front of the IRSF design, the 20-run IRSF design. And then it has 17 points show up on the Pareto front. And you can see the top left corner, the purple point there represents the RSF design, which offers the best space filling for the response value. And then the bottom right, the green point is the ISF design, which offers the best space filling for the input space. And then the rest of the blue points represent the design options that offers different level of trade-off between the two objectives. So the shape of the Pareto front, which is concave away from the utopia point, indicates there's substantial trade-off between these two objectives, which means if we want to improve one criterion, it will necessarily require a bigger amount of sacrifice in the other, in the performance of the other criterion. So it requires more careful balance and trade-off when we're picking the best design for our particular design scenario. And next slide, please. All right, so now given the Pareto front of the IRSF design, we want to look at more of the individual design choices. Next, please. So the first design we look at, which is shown in the top plot on the right-hand side of the slide, is design number 2 on the Pareto front. So you can see, compare with the ISF design, which is shown at the top left corner, this design offers much better coverage of the response values. It sacrifices a little bit input space filling, but still, compared with the RSF design, it has better coverage near the bottom and also the left and right edges of the input space. Next, please. And then another design we look at is design number 4 on the Pareto front. And you can see, compare with design number 2, this one has better input space filling characteristic and still offers pretty nice response values over the range. So if the experimenter is interested in further improve the input space filling, they can look for the design choices that's further down on the Pareto front. The final decision should be made based on the experimenter's priority and after looking at the actual design options. But the Pareto front of IRSF designs offers a nice collection of design choices that balance both the input and response space filling characteristics. So next, Christine's going to talk about other space filling designs for sequential experiments.
Great, thank you, Lou. So what we've talked about so far is when you're going to use your whole budget, in this case, the 20 runs of our experiment at a single time. And so now what we'd like to do is, like, if we are not restricted to that, what can we do? And so the idea here is that we can learn a little something, figure out what's happening with the connection between our inputs and our response, and then use the next wave of design runs to be more strategic about meeting our particular goal. So again, with the 20 runs, now let's consider a 2-stage sequential experiment. And in the first stage, we're going to assume that we don't know anything. So we're just going to use a uniform space filling design to figure out what's going on. And then what we want to do is use stage 2, those final 8 runs that respond to what we've learned. And so we're going to have a couple of different cases of how do we respond and what are we trying to accomplish. So if we're going to respond, we better do something with those 12 runs and figure out what happened. So we're going to do some sort of analysis to figure out what our surface looks like based on the 12 runs. So one possibility, if we don't know much about the model form, is to go back to those low order polynomials. And because we have a down and then an up and then a down again, a quadratic won't do it. So here we fit a full 3rd order regression model, so with cubic terms in it. And based on those 12 runs, we fit the best surface that we can. And you can see it has a valley and it has a peak, and it didn't quite get them right, but it's got the major features of what's going on. And so we can now respond based on what model 1 tells us and figure out what to do with those next 8 runs. Another possibility is that our scientists or our engineers that we're working with know a little bit more about the functional form. And so then we can have a second model here which has the right general focus, but you can see it now has some parameters that tell us, we don't know how high the peak's going to be, how low the valley's going to be, but we know some basic shapes. So depending on what we know, we can fit some different models. And now we want to use that information that we've gotten to guide our future choices. Okay, so now let's assume that we're trying to optimize. So in this case, we're trying to figure out where the smallest value is and where the biggest value is. And so we're again going to use those non-uniform space filling weights that Lou talked about earlier, and we're going to make them proportional to the absolute value of what we've estimated the function to be. So here's the cubic regression model, and you can see that the red dots, so those are the 8 stage 2 runs, those have been placed where, in fact, we have big values of the estimated response. And depending on our maximum weight ratio, we emphasize that big values for the weights more or less. If we do the same thing for the maximum weight ratio, for the model 2, where we have more understanding of the functional form, you can see that those red dots again are more closely clustered in the more desirable regions of the bottom of the valley and the top of the mountain. Okay, so for optimization, we've taken what we know for those 12 runs, and we've been intentional or strategic about what we do with those 8 runs because we are trying to optimize. Another possibility would be that we are trying to figure out which of these 2 models is right. So we're trying to do some model discrimination. So here we've got the same estimated response surfaces for the 2 models. And now what we're going to do is figure out the discrepancy. So this interesting plot on the right has a value of 0 if the 2 functions agree at a particular location. And then the bigger the difference is in what the models are predicting for a particular location, that corresponds to bigger values of this discrepancy. So if you look in the bottom left or top right corners, model 1 is saying that we have some curvature going up or going down, but model 2 is saying it's flat. And so that's a region where our 2 models seem to be saying very different things. And so by using this discrepancy surface, we can figure out where to put our design points to unravel which of the models seems better. So the left-hand plot is a uniform space filling design where I've just said, I'm ignoring whatever I've learned in the first stage, and I'm just going to put the points wherever there's a space in the input space. But the middle and the right-hand ones are using that discrepancy value as a weight. And so it's emphasizing regions where there's big differences. So you can see top left and bottom right, bottom left and top right corners. That's where we don't know what's happening. And so we've put some design points to help unravel which of those models makes the most sense. So the discrimination or the discrepancy piece, we can use that to advantage if we're trying to firm up which of the models is actually the better one. A third possibility would be that we're trying to get good coverage in the response space as well. So an input response space filling design. Here's our 12 runs. And this is very similar to what Lou showed, that we have lots of values close to 0. Those come from the perimeter of the design space. And then only a small number of values that are outside of that small range right near 0. So we could use the next 8 runs and augment it with, again, an input focus. So just fill up that space with our 8 additional runs. And you can see when we look at the right-hand plot, we didn't accomplish much in terms of covering that range of responses. At the other extreme, we could put all 8 of those runs that are available to trying to get good coverage in the response space. And you can see we've done pretty well. We can't change the blue lines because we've already collected that data, but the purple lines do a nice job of populating the range of response values that are out there. So those are the 2 extremes. And now we can build the Pareto front. So again, the purple one corresponds to focusing strictly on the responses in the second stage, and the green one corresponds to focusing just on the input space. And so now we have lots of other designs from different locations on that Pareto front, and you can see that they do a different quality job of filling the X space and filling the Y space. And so again, there's about 17, 18 possibilities here. And so if we show this to the experimenter, they'll be able to look at these different choices, make some comparisons, and figure out what makes the most sense for their experiment. How important is it to have good coverage of the responses? How important is it to have good coverage of the input space? And find some design that's a nice compromise that matches those priorities. So we're all about sort of empowering the experimenter to get the design that makes sense for them and what they're trying to accomplish. Okay, a few conclusions. I think it's very helpful to think carefully at that first stage about what you're trying to accomplish and figure out if a model-based design, where you have an assumed model that you have pretty good confidence will be appropriate for the results that you're going to see, or a space-filling design where you have rapid changes, discontinuities, or you just don't know what to expect. That's an important fork in the road to decide which one makes the most sense. And if you go down the space-filling one, we would like to suggest that if you know something, so if you have some knowledge or information, then uniformly filling the input space may not be the best strategy. And so the uniform space-filling design allows you to adapt those weights to match your particular objective and emphasize a region and de-emphasize a less interesting region. And then the input response space-filling design gives you that balance, and each experimenter can pick the right balance of how much to emphasize good space-filling for the inputs and good coverage of the range for the response. Sequential design of experiments, if you can do it, you should do it, because it allows you to sort of prevent some wastage, put some resources where it turns out it's not that interesting, and also adapt and sort of be able to cover a couple of different objectives. So explore first and then optimize, or explore first and then reduce the uncertainty that you have in what the response looks like. And so hopefully we've given you some ideas about just how versatile space-filling designs can be and how they can be made to match what your priorities are in the experiment and get sort of this tailored design that really accomplishes what you want your data collection to accomplish. So we have some references. The first one, I think, is a short little article that appears in the Statistics Spotlight in Quality Progress that just talks a little bit about that first choice. And then the other papers that we've written are more details about everything we've talked about here, and they all come with R code. So if you want to implement one of these methods for your particular scenario, then there's R code that you can use to actually use one of these designs for your experiments. All right, we'll stop there and we're happy to answer some questions. And I think maybe I'll pause for a moment in case someone wants to capture those references, and then I'll stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, those references will show up in the recording that will be posted on Coursera. So don't worry too much about that. People will be able to get their hands on that without too much trouble. And all of those are published in places that should be fairly easy for people to track them down. There's nothing in the Journal of Irreproducible Results that it's very, not many libraries have that one, so it's hard to track it down. Oh, let's see about if we have any audience questions or anything that we need to address. I don't know if anything came in.
So I do see one. Sorry, Megan, I didn't mean to interrupt.
I can't see anything. So.
Oh, okay. So there is one that says, can a space-filling design end up in a model-based design? And so I think this is a really interesting question. It's something actually that Lou and I have been thinking about is if you start off and you're not sure and you do a space filling design, you'd like it to perform well when you actually fit the particular model that you have. And so I think if you can do something sequential, there's a real opportunity there. You can start with space filling and then augment to do well with the model-based designs. But Doug, I know you have done some work with some of your collaborators that sort of talked about how robust things are if you do space filling and want to fit a model-based design or model-based process at the end. You want to talk about that, Doug? Or
yeah, I've done just a little bit of work with this, really sort of in the context of mixture experiments, because mixture experiments often have irregular regions, and because you have constraints on the component proportions, and so the sort of model-based design that you typically end up with is an optimal design, and I like to use optimal designs for that, because typically with a mixture experiment, you're ultimately interested in making predictions about what's going to happen at particular formulations of the product. But I've done a little bit of comparison of how, for example, how optimal designs compare to space filling designs, and the space filling design that I've actually looked at the most is the fast flexible filling designs that are available in JUMP, and I chose that for convenience, okay, because I could create both the optimal design, I could create the fast flexible filling design, and then I could evaluate both designs pretty nicely using things like fraction of design space plots. And what I found was that if I'm going to be fitting a second order mixture model, is that lots of times the space filling design works as well, or at least as well as the optimal design. And I was a little surprised to see that, but it is a but I was, you know, the more I thought about it, the more I said, well, you know, that's probably not unreasonable, because the optimal design does tend to put runs in the interior of that region, and that's exactly what's going on with the space filling designs. So that's sort of where I've left things, but it's an interesting question.
yeah. And I think we feel it's an opportunity and a question that people are asking of, you know, how do you get the right balance? And I think there's some opportunity there.
Oh, I think it's one that's ripe for sequential experimentation.
Yes.
Particularly if the model, the platform that you're experimenting on is a computer model, because you don't have the resource issues associated with physical experiments. You know, I've done a lot of work with what the military calls operational testing. And sequential experimentation is often very difficult in that environment, because in order to do one of these operational tests, you need equipment, you need people, and you need a range typically in which to do this. And often the big constraint is the range time. You know, so you run your first set of experiments and you say, gee, I need to run another 8, and you go back to the range managers. And they say, well, yeah, you can have time for another 8 runs, you know, in 12 months. You know, you can, yeah, and that's just a killer. You know, that's just a killer. But I'm really pleased to see that you are working on the sequential experiment part of this, because I don't see much of that going on in the computer world, where it's so natural to be able to do it. And of course, in physical experiments, we talk about sequential experiments all the time. I mean, you know, you start with screening, and then you do more exploration, and then you do, you know, there's an approach that's based on sequential experimentation, and being able to do this in the computer experiments world is really important. I think you've done some really interesting work there, and there's a lot more that can be done.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, another question. For 5 factors that have 3 levels, what's the adequate experimental plan and how to execute it? Oh, that's a wide open question, don't you think?
There's a lot of possible answers.
Yeah. And some of them depend on what you want to do. You know, are you interested in optimization? For instance, you know, there's a set of answers that if you're going to do optimization, you know, I immediately start thinking about a box banking design. You know, because everything's at 3 levels, nice, reasonable number of runs, although a 5-factor BBD is not a small design.
Right.
So you might think about an optimal design. And you could use either the D or the I criteria, depending on what you're thinking about doing.
Yeah, to me, the whole thing hinges on what are you trying to accomplish. The odds of being successful get much higher. If you know the answer to that, then you'll be able to target what to do.
Yeah.
And certainly in JUMP, there's some very nice tools that say, you know, here's the parameters. I guess the other question is, what kind of budget do you have?
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you have a big budget, there's a lot of things that you can do. If you have a tight budget, then I think there's probably going to be some trade-offs. And so, you know, what are you trying to accomplish? What's your budget? And then probably using some design that's tailored to match both of those sounds like a way to get started.
Another consideration is how long does each run take? You know, if runs are easy to do and you can do one of the test combinations and in a short period of time and get the results back. Now the whole avenue of sequential experimentation opens up, and so you may do, excuse me, you may do something completely different in that situation. Then if each run takes a week, you know, or is very expensive. In those kind of situations, there may be blocking considerations that have to be taken into account.
Yeah, that will certainly change the options.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question because it has a multitude of answers depending on all of this ancillary information that we're talking about here. And you know, if we have the information to narrow that down, you could probably make some more thoughtful recommendations. But good thinking, you know.
Yes.
Good question. Can I use Python in experimental design? If I knew enough about what Python was, I might be able to answer that. I think it's a programming language. Is that basically correct?
Indeed, yes.
Yes.
So do you want to take a shot at this, Doug, or would you want?
Well, I have my own prejudices. Okay, so let me explain my prejudices. Okay, I teach experimental design. Okay, to basically master's level students in engineering. Okay, and they come from lots of different areas. They come from industrial engineering, they come from computer science, they come from EE, they come from materials, chemicals. I got them all. Okay, my class this semester has 85 campus students and about 60 online students, and it's every discipline that you can think of. And I even get people from outside of engineering. I get people from biology. I get people from chemistry, physics. I just have I have quite an audience, right? And the requirement to get in this course is that they have to have had a basic course in statistics. Okay, and as Christine, Lou, as the two of you know, that covers a multitude of sins. Okay, some of those courses are really good courses. Okay, unfortunately, a lot of them suck. Oh, they're terrible courses. They're oftentimes that first introductory course, which is a service course for other people. You assign it to the person in the department who you're afraid to have teach your majors. Right. So what people learn in that course is often highly variable. And because of that, I have to be really careful to make sure that I teach concepts in the course. And I want to make sure that they master the concepts. And for a lot of these people, mastering the concepts is hard because they don't have the background. And then when I try to layer computer programming on top of that, it makes the course much more complicated and much harder. And what they end up doing is they end up focusing on the programming, okay, because they have to be able to do that to work the homework, okay, or to do their term project, and they don't really learn the concepts. So I don't use Python. I don't use R. I don't use anything that requires programming because it puts too much of an intellectual burden on the student. I use Jump or Minitab, and the reason I do that is because it's easy to use. It's menu driven. It's dialog boxes, and for my course, I actually have a set of video presentations that take every single example in my textbook and show you how to set it up and analyze it in Jump. By the way, Carly Metcalf, who the two of you know, one of my former students, Carly actually made those videos, and they're fabulous because she's such a great teacher. And I make those available to all of my students in my design of experiments class, and none of them have any problems with computing. They're able to handle it. And so I'm probably a renegade in that I'm not using R or something like that in my course, but I have to look at my audience, and I want my audience to learn design. I don't care whether they learn programming or not. That's somebody else's problem. So, yeah, what's your thoughts on this?
So I think my answer is the same, but maybe a slightly different perspective on it. So, you know, for some of the specialty things that Lou and I have done, you know, Lou is a whiz at programming, and so you need sort of specialized algorithms and, you know, searching through the space of all the possible designs to find the best ones is hard. And so I think I would recommend, if you have sort of a typical problem that fits into the space that Jump and others have explored and created the solutions, save yourself the anguish of coding everything from scratch and making sure your algorithm does the search effectively and those kinds of problems. You know, leverage the expertise that went into making some of these statistical software tools where you can just use it and trust the result. Because I think when we've done some of the specialty problems and coded things from scratch, you have to do a lot of checking to make sure that you've solved the problem that you intended to.
Right.
And so I think using, you know, leveraging the expertise and the brain power that there is for a professional software company just makes sense for an awful lot of problems. And it's only when you need to do something very specialized would I say, you know, think about programming it in R or in Python or something else, because the standard tools that are out there won't do the job for what you need. But if they will, don't reinvent the wheel. So Lou, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I think I agree with both of you, certainly. So this semester I'm teaching a reliability course, and I think the biggest struggle the students having is with programming in R for those likelihood functions with different kind of reliability data with different sensor mechanism. So I can see how that add extra challenges for the students. So yeah, using the existing software to try to make it easier for students to learn in the concepts, I definitely think it's a great idea. Yeah, but for some like specialty things or new methodologies, I think yeah, it probably requires a little bit more programming. But if there's, for example, like our Shiny app, which can be make things easier for the users, I think that will be really helpful for disseminating the results and facilitate broader application for the users.
Yeah, one thing that I have done, my research students, of course, end up doing things that are not standard. I always tell you, if we knew what we were doing, it wouldn't be research, right? So there's not standard software, but instead of doing the coding in R or in some other language, I've encouraged them to use jump scripting. And the nice thing about jump scripting is once you have a jump script that works, then that can become a standard option in jump, and you can add that to the toolbar. And everybody that's got jump can now use your method, can use your algorithm, and that's to me kind of an alternative way to do it. And another issue with R and programs like Python is R is open source, and a lot of companies will not let you use open source software on their computers. Whereas if they have jump, there's no problem using an add-in or using a jump script. So that's another issue that we have to think about. We're getting close to the end of our time here, and I want to thank both of you for taking so much time to spend with us today. I always enjoy doing this, and I have found this to be a very enlightening presentation, and I already have some ideas and some things I want to go and take a look at. So this has been very entertaining and very informative for me. This is the end of today's session. I need to tell you a little bit about what's coming, folks. We are going to have a short break for the summer. This is the last Fireside Chat for spring. We are going to start again. I'm planning to start again in August because that's when ASU starts up. And I need to take a look at the academic calendar and see what our exact schedule is going to be. But I do have guests already sort of waiting in the wings, chomping at the bit to join us for fall. And I hope that all of you will come back. I got some interesting topics and interesting guests planned, and hope to see all of you back again. And again, Christine and Lou, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate this. Christine has done this before, so I keep calling on her to come back, and Lou, I'm sure we'll have you folks back again sometime. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We
Thank you.
enjoyed it.
Yeah. Thank you, Doug.